This is the Christian Heritage London podcast from London.
Well, it's an absolute delight for me to be talking with Bill Edgar, the professor, or are you emeritus professor now, Bill?
I am emeritus as of July.
At Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. But as we discussed previously on the Christian Heritage London podcast, you're someone who's lived in a handful of nations. You've spent your time in France. Where else?
Well, I grew up in France. I haven't actually lived anywhere else except the U.S., but I've traveled extensively. But I grew up in Paris and worked in Aix-en-Provence for over a decade.
Excellent. Well, you've written this book about which I'd like to talk with you, this excellent book, A Supreme Love. And in this book, you make the point that it's a historic point. On June the 19th, 1865, the Confederate forces, having surrendered, the Union soldiers arrived in Galveston, Texas, spreading the good news of the end of the American Civil War. The date, some 2.5 years after official emancipation, became a metaphor for the newly minted freedom declared but unrealized. General Order Number 3 is a moving piece of legislation. And then you quote, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired laborer." You then go on to quote the writer Ralph Ellison, who writes that, "But what a feeling can come over a man just from seeing the things he believes in and hopes for, symbolized in the concrete form of a man, in something that gives a focus to all the other things he knows to be real, something that makes unseen things manifest and allows him to come to his hopes and dreams through his outer eye and through the touch and feel of his natural hand." And you then comment, Ralph Ellison's posthumous novel, Juneteenth, which included that quote, contains many of the great poet's thoughts about life and music. Jazz was, for him, the embodiment of what it means to be human. So having discussed massive facts of history, extraordinary variables of the human condition and experience, you come down on that fascinating factor, the subject of jazz, the spontaneous, the improvisatory art form, the modern art form, which you argue has come out of a very historic moment and which speaks of freedom, speaks of incarceration, speaks of joy in pain. How is it that you came first to be interested in jazz, Bill?
Oh, Ben, that's a great question. I grew up with it. I was blessed enough to be in a family that loved jazz. I don't think this is in the book, but my mother had 2 requirements for her boys because we came from a little seaside town. One is that they learn how to swim as fast as possible, and the 2 is that they could dance. And so we used to clear the furniture out, and she would show us how to do the Charleston and other dances. And my dad had an extensive jazz collection, which I grew up on. And then I started my own collecting. And eventually, I took to the piano quite early on, and eventually started a little group, and it developed into a jazz band. And the band has been tremendously fulfilling. We've traveled extensively, particularly in Eastern Europe, and a bit in the UK. That's where I met you, I think.
Yes.
So jazz has been a part of my life, my spirit, my soul, my raison d'etre. And I've spent much of my adult life studying its nature and its history. There's lots more to go, but I'm getting on in years, so we'll see what happens.
It is fascinating reading the book how very much rooted in history the story of jazz is, and how unique it is as an art form. It's fascinating to me. I frequently give people tours in the British Museum, and of course when you look at the ancient art and then you see the Renaissance, you see, well, the Renaissance was wonderful, but it was a rebirth of something that happened before. But in jazz we see something almost unique.
I think that's right. it's not a rebirth of anything, strictly speaking, although, of course, there are elements of European music, African rhythms, and other sources like popular music, work songs, and so on. But they all came together and converged into a very unique form of music. No one quite understands how it happened. It's a bit like a miracle, but in the early 20th century, it came together and it became jazz.
One of the things that you talk about in the book is the whole factor of stories. And you mentioned an anecdote of how two trumpeters go to hear the young trumpeter Roy Eldridge as he was young. And you mentioned how the younger trumpeter was very impressed with Eldridge's technique, but the older trumpeter said, yes, but he doesn't know how to tell a story yet. Now, the thing is, what's fascinating is, as a jazz, and someone who enjoys jazz as I do, and as you play it, you know what you mean by that. And I remember reading the liner notes of a record about the music of Schubert and being quite moved because the man started to talk about Schubert's enjoyment of contemplation of eternity. And I'm thinking, how does he also see that in Schubert, who was writing music without words for that particular record? But we know something of these things which don't have words, but we recognize them. Now, you haven't explored this necessarily as a Christian subject, but then you say secular. What is secular if the whole world is owned by God?
Right.
You've pioneered in this subject, although you reference people like Rookmaker. You see it uniquely. Is this something which you discussed at L'Abri when you were with Schaeffer?
I don't remember I remember discussing jazz very much, and Rookmaker was involved in our life, a kind of a mentor and friend, and we went to listen to music together. But I don't remember evoking the subject of story. I think that's come later in my experience. And it's a little bit elusive. What I mean is the ability to move, this is very simple, but from a beginning to a middle, back to home, back to the beginning, with creative tensions and rabbit trails and so on, but always united in a particular tale. And most of the music that I enjoy most does that. Duke Ellington, to the untrained ear, might be a lot of random, loud sounds, but actually he was a master storyteller because he kept to his themes. The musicians improvised, to be sure, but they did it by respecting one another and listening to one another, and as we call it in jazz, riffing off one another. So the best of the music is never far from some central story.
This is fascinating because you're describing something which I'm presently reading 2 Corinthians in the morning, and we see this fascinating idea of the life in the spirit, and the Paul's making comparisons between treasure in glass, in jars of clay, and living by faith and not by sight. And in jazz, we have this art form wherein you have spontaneity, but in the context of a structure. You have freedom, but spontaneity doesn't always lead to freedom. Now, these are very scriptural categories, and yet,
yeah, absolutely,
it leads you to the kinds of questions which only the gospel answers. And you mentioned talking to Dave Brubeck on one occasion, and he said, "Yeah, my music is I've written more sacred than anything else."
The Bible is a massive story. You don't want to make that sound, kind of childish, but it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The middle is full of ambiguity and suffering, as well as some strands of hope. But the end is a glorious hope. And I think the best of jazz has these qualities to it. Not every part of the story is in one piece, but jazz typically begins with a theme. We call it the head, and then it starts to develop this theme in all kinds of ways, and some ways are very tense and full of friction, but they always resolve. And in the end, you go back to the head, having had this wonderful journey, where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And
Yes.
the pieces fit together in a way they hadn't before. So, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And, the two errors that I think you find in some music, one is so to concentrate on the ambiguities of the middle that you lose hope. And the other is the opposite, so to concentrate on the happy ending that you don't have tension. And I think the best of jazz does both.
That's fascinating. And so you see that possibly one of the high points would have been Kind of Blue, where you have that extraordinary tension, but you also have the extraordinary lyrical beauty and the happy endings. You feel, where are they? You know they're coming, but you don't want it to stop.
Very good. Yeah, that's one of my favorite albums. And that's very profound. Now, it's a bit like your Schubert. His music is like that, whether with words or not. And all great music has this quality. Perhaps Bach is the superb example of it. But then there's music that errs on the side of either overstressing the darkness or overstressing the happy ending without going through the valley of the shadow of death. So anyway, the best of jazz is a great story.
Yes.
And that's one of the reasons I love it so much.
Yeah. Now, you dwell so long on the history. Could you give our listeners an introduction to what it is that you consider in the book from the historical perspective of how this extraordinary art form began and developed?
Yeah, I'll try. The evolution of jazz comes out of the experience of slavery. Now, there were precedents in Africa to good music that wasn't representative of slavery, but the bulk of it comes from the enslaved Africans who, I explain this in the book, developed a hope many times because of the gospel. And so, for example, spirituals, which the world loves, came out of the singing of enslaved Africans who, though sorely, miserably oppressed, had a hope. You think of Motherless Child, which is mostly about alienation. But then there's interspersed with it words of hope, true believer, and so forth. Others are more positive altogether. I'm on my way to Canaan, goes one of the spirituals. And Canaan is so prominent that the journey, hard as it is, takes on a meaning. So this music, and there were other kinds that came out of the slave experience besides spirituals, blues, ragtime, marching bands, particularly in funerals. You can't understand the evolution of jazz without understanding some of that history. And I often tell friends that want to know what jazz is to study the history of slavery, or to go and watch chain gangs and how they'll be singing. There's a great movie based on a true story about Leadbelly, who was a legendary blues singer, gospel singer, who was unjustly imprisoned, and he began to play songs of stark reality, but always ending in some sort of hope, to the point where white audiences, including the governor of his state, hired him because they saw in it something that was much more positive than the complaints that most prisoners make. So, long way of saying, to understand jazz, one must understand the oppression of slavery.
Yes, it's a striking point that you make, that, again, a very scriptural point, that the Bible doesn't gloss over pain. And the great insult of the prosperity gospel is, you think, that how could anyone believe in a prosperity gospel when the Bible is so full of suffering and yet rejoicing? And you describe numerous people who have suffered utterly unjustly in slavery, and yet they find encouragement, profound encouragement, in an eternal hope, and that is expressed in the beauty of music. And of course, one of the delightful things you serve us with throughout the book is all of your footnotes have YouTube links, so we can actually listen. You can actually listen to the jolly tunes, which is an extraordinary.
That's right. Well, and if you have the Kindle version, you can do it just by pushing a button. Otherwise, it's a pain to look at the YouTube references. But they're there because unless you hear this and put it in your soul, you can't sort of get it anyway. And then there's a very small discography at the end for people who don't know much about jazz but want to be introduced to it. And I try to, cite recordings that really are important in the history of jazz. So yeah, I'm glad to hear that you picked that up, because the book by itself is just words, but it's the sounds that count.
Yeah, that's right. You and I have been sharing a couple of poems by email, and as I was reading, you sent over a reference to a poem by Hausmann, and as I read it aloud, that's when it started to make sense. The great poem.
Very good.
My first degree was in classics, and they always say when you're actually reading Virgil, it doesn't make sense until you hear it aloud. And
that's right.
In that sense, I would propose to you that something of what you've done in this book is jazz, in that you are essentially exposing us to something and saying, what do you think? Because there is something extremely personal about hearing a piece of jazz where you hear My Funny Valentine, and Miles himself said he said, I didn't get it. I didn't get My Funny Valentine until and then one day when I got it, when it meant something to me, then he played it differently.
Yeah, that may be the highest compliment I've ever received, because I wanted the book to be both descriptive but evocative, and so to think that there's maybe some music in the text is high praise for me.
Well, that's it. I think what you're doing throughout the text is you see, look at this, look at this, look at this. But there's also something rather fathering about that. I remember when I first discovered classical music as a 15-year-old, and thinking I didn't know where to go next. I was spending huge sums on Prokofiev, which I later learned was a mistake. I should have been listening to Mozart. I needed someone to explain. You should be listen to Bach first. Don't be spending all your money on these guys. But yes, it's very helpful, this bibliography at the back, because you're saying, here, this is a good one. You might like this. This is a good one. Have a go. See what you think. Now, there's something also, put it to you like this. I once asked Tim Keller a question. I asked him, how is it that you grew that church in New York through personal evangelism? How do you do personal evangelism in such a way that you don't come across just as a difficult salesman? And he said the importance of asking questions, the importance of listening to your friend. And in that, you're at no point do you say, right, you've got to get this. In jazz, it's so subjective, so personal in that way.
Yeah, and you can't be preachy about it. You can proclaim the beauties, but without a moralistic overtone. So, that's true. That was a wonderful insight of Tim's, and got to be true of life in general, that it's an interplay between you and the environment and the audience that you've been given. And if you're not willing to listen, if you're just preaching, then you're missing much about life.
Yes, this is it. I mean, even Edwards, he says, I can describe honey to you, but until you've tasted it, I can only do so much.
Yeah, good for him. I didn't know that quote, but he obviously, because of his experience of revival, had to have picked up all that was around him. In fact, any good minister of a church has to know the plight, the ups and downs, the victories, but also the trials of the people. Otherwise, the sermons will just be. I've often, this is pretty naughty, but I've often thought, what if my brother, who's not particularly an evangelical, were sitting next to me in a perfectly good church? He wouldn't be critical or negative about the sermon. He would simply ask, what planet is this guy from? And I think a lot of our preaching, I don't mean to be critical, because it's a noble profession, that a lot of the preaching that you hear is from another planet, uses other language, it uses conventions that don't connect with people, and you can't do that unless you connect with them.
This is it. I think it's delightful that often you see that, some of the most beautiful and effective preachers have been those who win their audience. They win them first, and there's something of beauty in this. There's something of beauty. Someone who can tell a story. As I say, I frequently give tours in the British Museum, and I've often noticed the thousands of people milling around. Literally, you'll have maybe 20,000 people in the museum at any one time, but they're lost. They've got no one to tell them what these items mean. And so when I'm there telling a story, people will crowd round and join in and listen.
I love that. Yeah. We were at one museum with, I think he's a friend of yours, Ben Quash, and he was going over paintings that had images of black people, and it was riveting. And suddenly you look around and there's a whole crowd listening because, they wouldn't have known what to make of it without a guide. And we need guides in life, don't we?
Yeah. Yes, this is it. I heard someone said he had C.S. Lewis as his tutor at Oxford. He wrote an essay about it, and he said when C.S. Lewis was your tutor, he wouldn't tell you, he wouldn't lord it over you. He would come alongside you, and together you would try to understand what the text meant.
Yeah, I was about to bring him up. He's a great example of that. When I was a brand new Christian, I devoured Lewis, and I was rather disagreeable evangelist about him, and I gave him around to friends, and one of my friends said something very profound. He said, Lewis first makes friends with you and then persuades you.
That's magnificent.
And I think that's a high praise.
That's what you want, isn't it? I mean, that seems so biblical.
I know, that's what Jesus did.
Well, this is it. It's exactly. Yeah, it's wonderful. Now, so I would like to introduce. Can I open up a slightly different development, a new rabbit trail here?
Sure, please.
The subject of spontaneity has usually been associated with freedom, and yet spontaneity can become as much of a drudgery as the most staid liturgy. And I would propose to you that there is something in jazz, the most articulate musicians like an Oscar Peterson or John Coltrane, for example, the diligence that they've applied to their art is what facilitates actual freedom. Is this something you've considered much?
Oh, I have thought about it a lot, and you picked a couple of good examples. John Coltrane practiced for hours and hours a day, and when he was younger, Oscar was locked up into a room with a piano by his dad, and he said, "You better learn your scales better than anybody else." And when he plays, you don't think it's pedantic or that technique lords it over anything else, but it's all in his DNA. It's all in his veins. Yeah, I mean, that's a profound point. So-called free jazz, if you listen to it a lot, it's not really free at all. They don't have a beat or a melody or a recognizable gravity point. It starts and then it just goes in every which way. So that's not freedom. That's chaos. Nor is freedom being locked into patterns in a way that's mechanical. As I said, I lived in France, and a lot of French people love jazz, and they're just wonderful. But some of the people I played with, how to say this kindly, were mechanical about it. They counted the measures. They didn't hear it. There's a technique that we use called trading fours, which means that you and another musician, usually the drummer, play alone for 4 measures, and then the drummer plays for 4 minutes measures. And it's really fun to do that. It's a kind of a dialogue. And I remember playing with French people who didn't hear it in their hearts. They had to hear it in their heads with numbers, and it didn't come out well. So it's not just French people. It's anybody who's learning jazz from a different background. They're enslaved to the the mechanics of it. So freedom is both truly spontaneous because it's within a framework, and not locked in to the framework in a way that is mechanical.
Well, you see, these are gospel variables, aren't they? These are gospel elements. You're describing freedom. I suppose that's why that was what makes the book so interesting and makes the subject so interesting, is that you're describing something which is based on has improvisation at its very heart, has spontaneity at its very heart, but which requires extraordinary diligence and requires extraordinary boundaries. And you're thinking, what else besides the gospel it depends on this in such a the Christian life knows all about this. It's a fascinating parallel.
Absolutely. There's a great verse in the book of Hebrews. The author is saying you should have become adults by now, but you're still children. And then he says the way you become an adult, I'm paraphrasing, is to exercise the difference between right and wrong in the gymnasium of life.
Wow.
That's the Greek word, gymnasio. And that's so true, that you can't just develop maturity in the Christian life by sitting in an armchair and reading devotional books. That's a help, of course, but you've got to go out to the gymnasium of life and test it out and make mistakes, as well as discover that God's way ahead of you in every case.
This is it. And again, it's fascinating. Again, that's another subject you bring up in the book a handful of times and powerfully, is the element of risk in jazz. You may go somewhere where you may lose the band.
Oh, indeed.
And there's that fascinating element.
That's exactly right. And that happens when a really superb musician is playing with mediocre musicians. The superb guy goes off and they don't follow him. I remember as a kid watching Pele play soccer. We call it soccer, football. And when he retired, he came and played for a New York team, the Cosmos, who were very good. But he would set up plays, and they didn't get it. They didn't follow. They didn't see where the ball was going. And he was very gracious about it. But, he was used to playing with a level of people that could support him. Well, that's the same in not only jazz, but all of life.
Yes, that's right. We see that again in the great heroes of church history. We see that again and again. These guys who, I believe I must go, I must run. And you see, it's interesting. You tend to find forerunners like a Whitefield, but he'll have others around him. Thomas Kidd, in his biography of Whitefield,
that's right,
he makes the point that Whitefield wasn't only a wonderful example, but he was a network builder. And one of the greatest literature he left behind was letters. He's writing to people saying, "Come, let's go." And people got up and ran with him, as it were. And there's that, there's something of relationship among these people.
I don't think there's any great leader, be it a musician or a politician or a preacher, that is not somehow grounded in a network. You think of, you would know this better than I, but think of Wilberforce. Now, you think of him as somebody who was so creative, so courageous, fighting Parliament against slavery, and he did all that. But he had the Clapham group that was there to support him, pray for him, make suggestions. He had his friend John Newton tell him, try this and try that. So that's true of jazz and any other form of life.
Right.
You need a network of people, which is also a biblical idea. Jesus gave us the church. He didn't just say, "Okay, you're on your own. Roll up your sleeves."
That's right. That's right. Yeah, it is. Isn't it interesting? You always see what comes from the gospel. You often see it's like the whole picture of the seeds going, which reproduce more seeds, which reproduce more. I was fascinated to learn recently that there was a fellow called George Williams who used to live in London next to St Paul's Cathedral. I learned recently that while he moved to London, he found there were lots of nice young men around him, but they were prey to all kinds of temptations and trouble.
Oh, yeah.
And so this young man, George Williams, said, "I'm going to set up an organization. I'm going to call it the Young Men's Christian Association." Now, from the YMCA, you get the Red Cross, you get basketball, you get extraordinary blessings. And you see, Christianity has brought blessing, which has brought blessing. which has brought blessing. And there's something about life in it. Now, what's interesting here is there's this little bit of a parallel. You're talking about, so for example, when Louis Armstrong sets up the All-Stars, he has guys who all could be band leaders. And when Miles Davis led bands where each of them would go on to become legends, and then he starts a new band, and each of those guys goes on to become a legend. It's fascinating, isn't it?
It's totally fascinating, and so true to life. Then the downside is that when that wonderful traditionalism is gone, you have only the vestiges of good music or good things without that life force, without the iron pill that is provided by people who are conscious of starting institutions and helping people to move on with life. And that's sadly happened to the Y in some ways. The C part is gone.
Oh yeah, certainly, that's right. But that was another
At
thing.
least in America.
Yes. It's very interesting how so many of these Christian organizations begin. The Christian sets them up, and then it gets handed off to the world. And the Christians carry on with preaching the gospel, but then the world carries on with the hospitals, the universities, the schools, the welfare state, and so many things which were begun by Christians. It's a very interesting point. But also, you make the point in the book, and I think there's also a parallel here. You make the point in the book that there's been a time when what was begun as a new art form was then considered to be safe. And was considered to be part of the establishment. And so Miles Davis himself turns from the beauty of what he had begun into this much more experimental thing, and no one seems to continue in it. It seems to be, rather than being a new art form, it's considered to be safe.
Very good point. I went to a university which started as a place to train ministers, and because of that, they developed this liberal arts tradition that was equal to none. Today, the university does liberal arts, but they don't know why. And they're certainly not training ministers. Yeah. So it's kind of, by common grace, it's doing some good things, but a lot of it is just surface. So you need to have that living tradition. I was privileged to be a part of a jazz festival for years and years in Easton, Maryland, which is on the shore. And the leader of it is a fellow named Monty Alexander, who I mentioned in the book.
Yes.
And his gift is to bring younger, lesser-known musicians, put them on the stage, and let them learn from each other, and particularly learn from him, of course. If you'd asked me 20 years ago, I would have said, jazz doesn't have much of a future. After being in this festival, I would say, jazz has a wonderful future because these young people are picking up the sense of it and they're moving ahead to the next stage. And it's a beautiful thing. They're aware of the roots, but they want to move on. And that's biblical too, I think.
Yeah, it is. It's another of those parallels. Oh, this is outstanding. It's fascinating to talk with you, Bill. But the book itself is such a feast. It's a great diversion for people who have been already interested in jazz, but it also would be a brilliant introduction to anyone who's interested in jazz. It's unique, as I understand it, as an introduction, but also as a context in which you can reflect on the profound issues of this unique art form, in which we find spontaneity, we find improvisation, and yet we find the need for harmony, cooperation, leadership, structure. So thanks ever so much for talking with us about this, Bill, and thank you so much for writing this excellent book.
Thank you so much.
For more episodes of the Christian Heritage London podcast, and for information on Christian Heritage London events, tours and walks, please go to christianheritagelondon.org.